What would you do if at 19 years old, the last of your family turned you out onto the docks with a trunk you couldn't afford to keep and a debt you never agreed to owe? Hester Quill had asked herself exactly that on a raw April morning in 1871, standing on the fish-slicked planks of Sable Cove, Massachusetts, while her stepfather's creditor pried the door of her childhood home shut against her for good. She had $7 to her name, folded twice inside her glove, and nothing else but the clothes she stood in and a needle case that had been her mother's. So when she wandered past the harbor's weekly auction of unclaimed cargo and heard the auctioneer practically beg someone to take a battered old sea chest off his hands, its lock rusted shut, its wood swollen and split from some forgotten wreck, she handed over every last coin she had for it, without quite knowing why. The crowd thought her a fool, wasting her only money on a box too ruined to even open properly. What none of them could have guessed, as she dragged that chest away through the mud, was that sealed inside its false bottom lay the final secret of a vanished pirate king. A secret that would not only deliver Hester from ruin, but would restore an entire dying harbor to life. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Hester Quill. If you have ever been handed someone else's debt and told to carry it as your own, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if stories like Hester's speak to something in you, we'd be honored if you'd follow or subscribe to our channel so more of them can find their way to you. Hester Quill had not been born to poverty, though poverty found her early enough that she scarcely remembered a time before it. Her father, Thomas Quill, had been a rope maker of some modest standing in Sable Cove, a man whose calloused hands could lay a line so true that sea captains up and down the Massachusetts coast asked for his work by name, and who had taught his only daughter, almost from the time she could walk, the particular discipline of patience that rope-making demands, the slow, unhurried twisting of fiber into strand, strand into line, line into something strong enough to hold a ship against a gale. He used to tell her, as she sat beside him in the rope walk with hemp fibers caught in her hair, that most people wanted their strength all at once, in a single dramatic pull, but that real strength was laid down slowly, twist by patient twist, until one day you looked back and found you were holding something that could not be broken. Hester loved him fiercely, and loved the rope walk's particular smell of tar and hemp, and loved most of all the quiet certainty in her father's voice when he told her that a woman who understood patience need never fear being poor in the ways that truly mattered. He died of a fever when she was 11, and within 2 years her mother, Agnes, remarried out of necessity rather than affection to a man named Corwin Pratt, a coastal trader of middling fortune and considerable charm, who arrived in Sable Cove full of talk about shipping contracts and coastal routes, and a future far grander than a rope-maker's widow could otherwise have hoped for. For a while, that future seemed almost real. Corwin was not unkind to Hester in those early years, in the distracted, half-attentive way of a man more interested in his ledgers than his stepdaughter, and Agnes, grateful for the roof over their heads, chose not to look too closely at the increasingly reckless nature of her new husband's ventures. Hester, meanwhile, grew from a watchful girl into a capable young woman, apprenticing herself informally to a harbor chandler named Obadiah Finch, who had known her father and who taught her, alongside the practical arts of splicing and knotwork, the equally valuable art of reading a ship's manifest for what it did not say, of noticing which cargoes were declared and which quietly were not, of understanding the particular silences that fell over a room when certain names were mentioned at the docks. She learned to keep her own counsel, to watch closely, and to trust the patient, careful judgment her father had planted in her long before his death. It was her mother's death, when Hester was 17, that began the slow unraveling of whatever fragile stability remained. Agnes had been the one thread holding the household's uneasy peace together, and without her, Corwin Pratt's true nature revealed itself with startling speed. He had, it emerged over the following 2 years, mortgaged nearly everything he owned against a series of increasingly desperate shipping ventures, chasing one failed scheme after another in an effort to recoup losses that only ever compounded. And he had done so, Hester discovered far too late. Using not only his own modest holdings, but a legal claim against the small rope, making property her own father had left her. Tangled up in a guardianship arrangement Corwin had quietly arranged in the year after Agnes's death, when Hester was still a minor in the eyes of the law and in no position to object. By the time she turned 19, the last of it collapsed entirely. A creditor from Boston, a hard, unsmiling man named Alden Marsh, who had bought up the bulk of Corwin's debts at a steep discount in hopes of squeezing what profit remained from the wreckage, arrived in Sable Cove with legal papers and a constable in tow, and Hester found herself, on that raw April morning, watching her father's old rope making house. The last physical thing tying her to either of her parents, sealed shut against her by a man she had never met, for a debt that had never truly been hers, while Corwin Pratt himself had already fled 2 towns north rather than face the reckoning he had built with his own hands. She stood on the dock that morning with $7 sewn hastily into her glove, nearly the whole of her savings from 3 years of quiet, careful work mending nets and keeping books for Obadiah Finch. Money she had squirreled away against exactly this kind of disaster, without ever quite admitting to herself she expected it, and she felt, for the first time in her young life, the particular vertigo of having absolutely nowhere that was hers. It was in this state, hollow with grief and fury in equal measure, that she wandered toward the weekly dockside auction where Sable Cove's harbor master disposed of unclaimed goods and salvage, more to have somewhere to stand than out of any real interest, and found herself listening to the auctioneer, a weathered man named Silas Doyle, practically pleading with the thin Tuesday crowd to take an old sea chest off the town's hands. It had washed ashore, he explained, from some wreck 2 winters past, far enough gone in salt damage that its provenance could never be traced. Its lock rusted into an immovable lump, its lid warped nearly shut, and nobody in 3 auctions running had offered so much as $1 for it. When Doyle, more out of weariness than expectation, called out that he'd take $7 and be glad to see the last of it, Hester heard her own voice answer before she had fully decided to speak. She could not, afterward, entirely explain to herself why she'd done it. It was not that she believed, standing there in her grief, that the ruined old chest held any particular promise. It was rather that something in her father's old teaching about patience and strength, laid down slowly, rose up in her, at the sight of a thing everyone else had already decided was worthless, and she found she could not bear, on a morning when she herself had just been declared worthless by every legal document Alden Marsh could produce, to watch one more discarded thing be thrown away without at least being properly looked at first. She paid over every coin she had, watched the crowd shake their heads at the foolishness of a homeless girl spending her last money on a box she couldn't even open, and dragged the heavy chest through the mud to the only shelter she had left, a corner of Obadiah Finch's chandlery storeroom that the old man had quietly offered her for as long as she needed it, asking no questions and expecting no rent, in memory of the ropemaker he had once called a friend. It took her the better part of 2 days, working by lantern light after her chores at the chandlery were done, to free the chest's rusted lock, working it loose with vinegar and patient, careful pressure rather than force. The same unhurried discipline her father had taught her over 100 lengths of rope. When at last the lock gave way, and she lifted the swollen lid, she found the chest's interior disappointingly ordinary. A few rotted scraps of what might once have been oiled canvas, a corroded brass compass fused useless with rust, and little else besides the smell of old salt and decay that told her the sea had claimed whatever else it once held. She sat back on her heels in the lantern light, feeling the particular deflation of a hope she had not even admitted to having, and it was only in shifting the chest to examine it more fully, running her hand along its base out of the same restless habit that had always made her look closer at things others dismissed, that she noticed the bottom panel sat unusually high, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 inches between the chest's true floor and the ground beneath it, far more than any ordinary construction would require. Her father's old lessons in reading a plank's grain, and Obadiah's more recent lessons in reading a ledger for what it concealed, both rose in her at once. She worked her fingers along the panel's edge, found a seam disguised beneath a false run of nail heads that had never actually been driven through, and after several minutes of careful, patient prying, lifted the false bottom free to reveal a shallow cavity beneath, dry as tinder, in which lay a single oilskin-wrapped bundle that the sea itself had never managed to touch. Inside the oilskin, when Hester finally worked up the courage to unwrap it with hands that trembled more from anticipation than cold, she found a folded chart, its ink faded but legible, depicting a stretch of coastline she recognized with a jolt as the very shoals and inlets surrounding Sable Cove itself, marked with a series of careful annotations in a bold, slanting hand, along with a shorter letter, water-stained at its edges but whole, addressed to no one in particular, and signed only with a single initial, a stylized letter K, worked into a small flourish that resembled, on closer inspection, a bird in flight. The letter spoke, in language both proud and strangely weary, of a life spent taking from every flag and every port without loyalty to any of them, of a fortune built across 30 years upon the misery of honest traders and the losses of men who could ill afford them, and of a final reckoning the writer felt approaching with the particular clarity of a man who has outlived most of his enemies and finally begun to fear his own conscience more than any of them. It made brief, oblique reference to the chest's original owner, a shipmaster named Josiah Vane, who had once served, unwillingly, under a notorious figure the coastal towns had called, in hushed and fearful tones 2 generations before, the Kestrel, a smuggler king whose true name few had ever known, whose reach along the New England coast had once been the terror of every honest merchant, and whose final fortune, the letter implied without ever stating it plainly, had never been recovered after his disappearance at sea, presumed drowned some 40 years past. Hester sat with the letter, and the chart spread before her on the storeroom floor until the lantern guttered low, her mind turning over what she now held with a mixture of wonder and unease that kept sleep entirely at bay. She understood enough of Sable Cove's own half-forgotten history, gleaned from old Obadiah's stories and the town's older residents, to know that the name of the Kestrel was not entirely legend. There had been, within living memory of the very oldest inhabitants, a period some 4 decades before when the coastal trade along this stretch had suffered grievously at the hands of an unusually organized and unusually ruthless smuggling operation, one that had specifically and repeatedly targeted the very shipping routes that had once made Sable Cove modestly prosperous before its slow decline into the struggling harbor town it now was. Cargo seized, ships scuttled or driven onto the shoals, insurance claims that ruined more than one local family outright. It was, she began to realize, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold storeroom air, very possibly the original wound from which Sable Cove's long decline had first begun to bleed, the town never quite recovering its former modest prosperity in all the years since. If the letter's implications were true, and if the chart's careful markings could be trusted, Then somewhere along this very coastline lay whatever remained of a fortune, built directly upon the ruin of the town in which Hester now sat. Homeless and disinherited, in the dark. She spent the following weeks pursuing the chart's clues with the same unhurried, methodical patience her father had instilled in her, working her chandlery duties by day and in what daylight hours she could spare, walking the marked coastline with the old chart folded carefully in her apron pocket, cross-referencing its faded annotations against landmarks that had shifted or vanished across 40 years of tide and storm. She confided cautiously in Obadiah Finch, whose own father had lost 2 modest fishing boats to the smugglers' depredations in his youth, and who listened to Hester's careful account with an expression that moved slowly from skepticism to a grave, wondering hope. Together, they narrowed the chart's markings to a stretch of collapsed sea cave along the rocky point north of the harbor, accessible only at the lowest tides of the month. And it was there, on a cold morning in late May, working by the thin gray light with Obadiah standing watch above on the rocks, that Hester finally located, wedged into a fissure the sea had long since half collapsed, a second and far heavier iron-bound chest, its exterior corroded nearly solid, but its interior, protected by the same careful oilskin sealing that had preserved the letter, still holding a quantity of gold and silver coin. Foreign mint marks worn smooth with decades underground, along with a final ledger in the same bold hand as the letter, cataloging in cold, precise detail every vessel the Kestrel's operation had ever taken along this coast, the value of each loss, and, unmistakably, the names of the ruined families who had never received so much as an accounting of what had been stolen from them. News of Hester's discovery, however carefully she and Obadiah tried at first to keep their own counsel while they determined the right course of action, could not remain contained for long in a town as small and as hungry for talk as Sable Cove, and it was not many days before word of it reached the one man in Massachusetts with both the means and the motive to take a fierce personal interest, Alden Marsh, the very creditor who had seized Hester's father's rope, making property scarcely 2 months before. Marsh arrived in Sable Cove within the week, his manner considerably warmer than it had been on the morning he'd sealed Hester out of her own childhood home, full of smooth talk about how, given the legal entanglements still technically unresolved around Corwin Pratt's debts, any property or fortune recovered by Hester Quill while those debts remained outstanding might reasonably be considered forfeit toward their satisfaction. A legal argument built, Hester understood at once, on nothing more than the hope that a homeless 19-year-old girl with no family and no standing would lack the resources or the will to fight him on it. When she refused him outright, informing him with a calm she did not entirely feel that the chest and its contents had been found on her own initiative upon land unconnected to any property named in Corwin's debts, Marsh's warmth curdled quickly into open threat. He petitioned the county court to have the find seized as an asset of the bankrupt Pratt estate, arguing that Hester herself, as Corwin's former ward, could claim no discovery independent of that estate's tangled obligations, and he began, in the weeks that followed, to spread through the town his own version of events. That the Quill girl had stumbled upon stolen goods and meant to abscond with a fortune that rightfully belonged to his own claims against her stepfather, that a friendless orphan girl could not be trusted to manage such a sum honestly, that the matter belonged in the hands of men better equipped to see it properly settled. For several difficult weeks that summer, Hester found herself once again the subject of exactly the kind of suspicion her whole life had already taught her to dread. Summoned before the county court twice to answer questions about a discovery she had made through nothing but her own patient effort. Watching neighbors who had known her since childhood grow uncertain and wary as Marsh's rumors spread. There were nights, alone in Obadiah's storeroom, with the ledger's grim catalog of ruined families spread before her by lantern light. When she seriously considered simply taking what coin she reasonably could and leaving Sable Cove entirely, starting fresh in some town where Corwin Pratt's debts and Alden Marsh's threats could not follow her. But the ledger itself would not let her rest easy with that thought. Reading through its careful, damning entries night after night, she began to recognize family names still living in Sable Cove, the Applebys, who had lost a modest coasting sloop, and, with it, 3 generations' worth of slow-built prosperity. The Coffins, whose family fishing concern had never fully recovered from a single catastrophic loss, the ledger recorded in cold, exact figures. Old Widow Tar, down by the salt marsh, whose late husband's small trading venture, the ledger showed, had been deliberately driven onto the shoals in a manner that left no possible doubt of intent. Hester understood, turning those pages, that the fortune in her possession was not merely treasure, but restitution long overdue, and that walking away with it, however justified she might feel given her own treatment, would only complete the very theft the Kestrel himself had begun 40 years before, and, in his final letter, had so plainly wished undone. She gathered her evidence with the same careful discipline her father had taught her over lengths of rope, and Obadiah had reinforced over years of ledgers, compiling the Kestrel's own confessional letter, the recovered ledger with its exact catalog of losses, testimony from Widow Tar and several other older residents who could confirm the family names and circumstances the ledger described, and a formal survey Obadiah helped her arrange confirming the sea cave, where the chest was found, lay well outside any boundary ever associated with Corwin Pratt's mortgaged properties. She presented this evidence before the full county court on a July morning, standing alone before a room considerably more crowded and considerably more skeptical than the harbor auction where she'd bought the chest for $7, and made her case in a voice that did not waver, even as Alden Marsh's lawyer attempted repeatedly to paint her as an opportunist too conveniently placed to be believed. It was, in the end, the ledger's own damning precision that turned the room. Page after page of exact losses matched against family names still sitting in that very courtroom, several of whom rose unprompted to confirm details of ruin their own grandparents had spoken of only in bitter, half-remembered fragments. The judge, faced with a dead smuggler's own written confession and a claim from Alden Marsh built on nothing sturdier than opportunistic timing, ruled decisively in Hester's favor, dismissing Marsh's petition entirely and further noting, to the visible satisfaction of the courtroom, that his conduct toward a legal ward left destitute by her stepfather's own debts warranted no further indulgence from the court. Marsh left Sable Cove within the month, his reputation considerably diminished by a case that had, however unintentionally, exposed the same predatory opportunism the town had already begun to suspect in him. And he was not troubled to darken the harbor's docks again. What Hester chose to do with the fortune once her claim stood confirmed surprised the town rather more than her legal victory had. She did not, as more than one wagging tongue had predicted, take the gold and quietly vanish to some grander city, where nobody knew her as the girl who'd bought a ruined chest for $7. Instead, working alongside Obadiah Finch and a small council of the very families the ledger had named, she set about the slow, patient work of restitution the Kestrel's own dying letter had asked of whoever found his fortune. The Applebys received enough to rebuild the coasting trade their grandparents had lost, and within 2 years their small sloop was joined by a second. The Coffins used their share to modernize a fishing operation that had limped along on borrowed equipment for a generation. Widow Tar, well into her 70s and asking for nothing beyond a warm roof, was given exactly that, a small, comfortable cottage near the marsh she had lived beside her whole life. Built with Hester's own careful oversight of every board and nail, And Hester herself, with what remained after the town's restitution was complete, did not build herself a grand house on the strength of a pirate's fortune, but instead bought back, at last, her father's old rope-making property from the estate that had claimed it, restoring the rope walk to working order and reopening it under her own name, teaching 2 young apprentices, an orphaned boy and a widow's daughter, the same patient discipline of twist and strand her father had once taught her, so that the skill and the kindness that had carried her through her own darkest season might carry forward into someone else's. So we return, as we always do, to that raw April morning when a girl of 19 stood on a Sable Cove dock with $7 folded in her glove and nowhere in the world to call her own. Hester Quill did not buy a ruined sea chest that day. Though that was all the auction crowd believed she'd purchased, she bought, without knowing it, the unfinished conscience of a vanished pirate king, and the patience to see his final wish properly through to the families he had wronged. What had been sealed away in fear and guilt for 40 years was at last given freely in restitution, not only to Hester herself, who found in that ruined chest the first true foundation her own life had ever stood upon, but to an entire harbor town that had spent 4 decades quietly bearing a wound it never fully understood the source of, until one overlooked girl, working alone by lantern light with nothing but $7 and her father's patient teaching, finally brought that old wound into the light where it could properly heal. The rope walk her father built still turns out its careful, unhurried line today in the story we tell, strand by patient strand, in the hands of a young woman the world had once been far too quick to count as having nothing left to lose. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Hester's story tonight. If her patience, her quiet integrity, and her refusal to let one dishonest man define the whole of her fortune moved something in you, we would be so grateful if you'd share this story with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things are so rarely worthless, and if you'd follow or subscribe to our channel so more stories like this one can find their way to you. Before you go, we'd like to leave you with a question worth sitting with. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else around you had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and we always love hearing where in the world tonight's story found you. Until next time, stay close.